Snow was melting along a quiet Maine harbor when one German shepherd refused to leave an empty bench. Days earlier, Calder Vance had pulled that dog from beneath a fishing pier, tangled in line as the tide climbed around him. But once Morrow was free, he didn't run away. He went straight back to waiting for an old fisherman who had suddenly stopped coming. What Calder found wasn't a hidden fortune or a crime, but something far easier for a town to overlook: how quietly people can disappear from each other's lives. As a failing pier forced the harbor to change, a veteran, a stubborn fisherman, and a retired canine all had to face the same question: who are we when we're no longer needed the way we once were? Sometimes belonging isn't about being the strongest person in the room. It's about having someone notice when your chair is empty. Tell us where you're watching from, and if this kind of story means something to you, please like and subscribe. Help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. Calder Vance had planned to spend 1 hour in Port Cormorant, long enough to stretch his legs, find coffee strong enough to justify the stop, and let the old pickup cool before the final run south toward Portland. That was all. The job waiting for him there was exactly the kind he preferred now: marine maintenance on a coastal research vessel, 6 months under contract, clear responsibilities, predictable pay, and an ending already written into the paperwork. Calder had grown fond of arrangements that came with an expiration date. They asked less of a man. The road descended toward the waterfront between low buildings buried under the previous night's snow. Beyond them, the harbor opened under a pale blue January sky, bright enough to make him squint. Dark fishing boats sat against floating docks rimmed with ice. Smoke lifted from chimneys almost straight upward in the still morning air, while farther out, sea vapor drifted across the Atlantic like torn gauze. He parked outside a diner with steamed windows and a hand-painted sign that had probably been hanging there longer than some of the boats. Inside, warmth hit him first, then coffee. A woman behind the counter looked up as he entered. She was somewhere in her 60s, compact and silver blonde, with a short pencil tucked behind her right ear and the alert expression of someone who remembered what regulars ordered before they sat down. "You look like a large coffee," she said. Calder glanced at the row of mugs. "Is that a diagnosis?" "Experience." He almost smiled. Her name tag read Nora. She filled a paper cup without asking how he took it. "Passing through?" she said. "That obvious? You haven't complained about the harbor yet." "Give me 10 minutes." That earned a brief laugh. Calder paid, pulled his deep navy waxed canvas jacket closed, and went back outside before the diner could become comfortable. Comfort had a way of encouraging conversation. He crossed toward the waterfront with the cup warming one hand. At 57, Calder still moved like a man accustomed to unstable ground. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the compact strength built by years of hauling rope, climbing ladders, and working against weather rather than gym equipment. Dark ash-brown hair, silvering heavily at the temples, shifted across his forehead in the wind. A few days of gray-brown stubble roughened his jaw. He had left active Coast Guard service years ago, then eventually left the reserve too. But his body had never fully learned the difference between walking near water and assessing it. Current, wind, dock condition, ice, escape route. He noticed everything before he decided whether he cared. Old habits, he thought. Or old damage. Pier 6 extended from the quieter end of the harbor. Orange warning tape blocked the outer section, and the weathered sign read, "Restricted access, structural inspection pending." Calder slowed. The pilings below were old timber, darkened almost black where tide and salt had worked at them for decades. Snow covered most of the planks, except for narrow tracks left by boots. He took a drink of coffee. Something scratched beneath him. Calder stopped. He listened. A boat engine coughed somewhere behind him. A gull cried over the water. Then came the sound again. 3 quick scrapes. Wood against something harder. A pause, then a low, strained whine. Calder set the coffee on a piling cap and crouched. "Hey!" Nothing answered. He moved to the edge and looked beneath the pier. At first there was only shadow, gray timber, and dark water moving between the supports. Then 2 amber-brown eyes looked back at him. Hell. A German shepherd was trapped under the pier. The dog had wedged himself into the narrow structure between 2 braces, but that was not what held him there. A length of dark braided fishing line had wound around one piling and twisted several times through a faded marine teal harness. A large treble hook was caught in the nylon near the dog's shoulder, not in the skin. Calder checked twice before letting himself believe that. But every time the shepherd tried to move upward, the line tightened across the harness and pulled him sideways toward the brace. Water slapped a few inches below his hind paws. Calder looked toward the tide line. Rising. "Okay," he said quietly. "That makes this less optional." The shepherd watched him. Black saddle across a warm, sand-gold coat. Lean body, deep chest. One ear perfectly upright, while the tip of the right bent slightly outward. The dog was wet along the legs and belly, and cold had begun to work through him. Calder could see the tremor in the muscles beneath the coat. But the animal was not panicking. That interested him. Calder moved toward a red emergency box mounted near the pier entrance. Inside was a throw line, a basic flotation ring, and equipment that looked as though everyone hoped never to use it. He took the line. His hands began working before the rest of him had fully agreed. A bowline around a sound timber. A second securing point, test the load, check footing. He stared down at the cold water. For a fraction of a second, something old tightened across his shoulders. Not fear. Responsibility. The moment before somebody became yours to get home. Calder had spent years trying to live without that feeling. Then the shepherd shifted below him and the braided line drew tighter. Calder exhaled. Fine. He climbed down. His boots found the first crossbeam, slick with frost. He kept one gloved hand on the safety line and lowered himself another step into the timber framework. The dog's breathing quickened. Easy. The shepherd pulled once. Stay. The word came sharper than Calder intended. The dog froze. Calder stopped too. For several seconds, man and dog stared at one another between the pilings while gray water moved beneath them. Calder lowered his voice. Stay. The shepherd remained completely still. That was not luck. Calder had worked around enough trained animals during maritime searches to recognize the difference between fear suppressed by exhaustion and discipline waiting for direction. You know that word. The dog's left ear shifted toward him. Calder reached slowly toward the harness. No snap, no retreat. Just watchfulness. Who taught you? He did not expect an answer. Still, something in the animal's expression made the question feel less ridiculous than it should have. Calder pulled the folding marlinspike knife from his jacket pocket and opened the blade. The line had cinched in 3 places. He cut the first loop. The shepherd flinched at the release of pressure, but stayed. Good. Second loop. The tide struck a piling hard enough to splash icy water across Calder's boot. The dog trembled more violently now. Calder worked faster without becoming careless. That had once been his best skill. Not speed, refusing to let urgency turn into haste. He cut the last wrapped section, then turned his attention to the treble hook. One barb had punched through 2 layers of harness webbing and twisted back on itself. He could not simply pull it free. Calder braced the harness with one hand and used the pliers folded into his knife tool to bend the hook just enough to reverse it. The shepherd made a small sound. I know. Calder kept working. You've had a bad morning. The hook came loose. For a moment, nothing happened. The dog seemed not to understand he was free. Then the shepherd shifted his weight cautiously. Calder put one hand under the chest strap. Up. The dog responded instantly. Together they climbed. Calder pushed from below while the shepherd found purchase on the snowy edge of the pier. The dog hauled himself onto the planks, slipped once, then scrambled clear. Calder followed more slowly. When he pulled himself onto the pier, his gloves were wet and his coffee had gone cold. The shepherd stood 5 feet away. Calder expected him to run. A loose dog with no visible handler, frightened and recently trapped, should have created distance the moment the restraint disappeared. Instead, the shepherd shook hard enough to spray water across the snow. Then he turned. He walked past Calder, past the open route toward town, past the diner, straight to an old wooden bench near the beginning of Pier 6. Snow covered half the seat. The dog sat beside it and looked toward the road. Calder stayed where he was. Something about the choice disturbed him more than the rescue had. The dog was free, yet he had gone directly back to waiting. A woman's voice sounded behind Calder. "So that's where he got himself." Calder turned. A woman in her early 50s was approaching at a brisk pace, wearing a rust-red harbor jacket, dark insulated trousers, and rubber deck boots. Dark auburn hair streaked faintly with silver was pulled low beneath a knit cap. A radio was clipped high on her jacket. She glanced first at Calder, then the rope, then the dog. Her eyes sharpened. "You went under there?" "He was tied up in discarded fishing line." "Caught?" "Harness only. Hook didn't reach skin." The woman released a breath. "Good." She held out a gloved hand. "June Merriweather, harbor master." "Calder Vance." Behind her, Nora was standing near the diner entrance, arms folded. June noticed Calder looking. "Nora called me when she saw you climbing under my condemned pier." "Restricted," Calder said. "Not condemned." June gave him a flat look. "You read signs while ignoring them?" "Habit." To his surprise, one corner of her mouth moved. She turned toward the shepherd. "Morrow." The dog looked at her. Calder glanced over. "That his name?" "Apparently." June approached slowly. Morrow allowed her to get close, but did not leave the bench. "He's been hanging around the waterfront a few months," she explained. "West Tolland lets him sleep in an old boathouse when it gets bad. Nora feeds him. Couple of deckhands leave water out." "No owner?" "Not exactly." Calder looked at the faded harness again. "He's trained." June nodded. "We figured." Morrow's attention returned immediately to the road. Calder followed his gaze. Nobody was coming. "What's he waiting for?" June looked at the bench. The answer took longer than it should have. "Silas Reddick." "Who's that?" "Fisherman, 71. Been around this harbor longer than I've had this job." June brushed snow from the edge of the bench. "Silas sits here most mornings, 6-ish, sometimes earlier. Started feeding Morrow a while back." Calder watched the dog. "He his?" "No." "Dog thinks otherwise." "Maybe." June's expression changed subtly, not concern exactly, more like a thought that had finally become uncomfortable. Calder noticed. "When did Silas last show?" 3 days ago." Calder looked at her. "And nobody's looking for him?" June folded her arms against the cold. "Silas disappears sometimes. Goes up the coast with somebody, crashes on a boat, spends a few days helping with engines. He doesn't exactly file an itinerary. But the dog keeps coming here. Every morning." Morrow lowered himself beside the bench without taking his eyes off the road. Calder felt something tighten in his chest. Not alarm. Recognition. He had seen that kind of waiting before, not from dogs, from people who had convinced themselves that staying in one place long enough could change an outcome. June gestured toward Morrow. "Lenora Pike runs the veterinary clinic 2 streets over. We should get him checked at after that." Calder looked toward his truck. Portland, job, schedule. The simple life he had very deliberately arranged. Then he looked down at his soaked boots. "Yeah," he said. "I'll take him." Dr. Lenora Pike confirmed what Calder already suspected. Cold exposure, mild dehydration, a few superficial abrasions. Nothing serious. Lenora, a slim woman with a short, salt-and-brown bob and calm brown eyes, examined Morrow with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew that frightened animals noticed impatience before humans did. "He got lucky," she said. Calder leaned against the wall. He stayed still. Lenora looked at him over Morrow's back. "He usually listens when he decides somebody is worth listening to." Calder did not know what to do with that, so he ignored it. By early afternoon, there was no reason left for him to stay. Morrow stood outside the clinic while Lenora spoke with June near the entrance. Calder opened his pickup door. The shepherd watched him. Calder waited for the dog to look away. He didn't. "You've got people here," Calder said. Morrow's bent right ear twitched. "That's more than most of us get." Calder climbed into the truck. The engine turned over. He pulled onto the road. Port Cormorant began disappearing in the mirrors. For several minutes he felt relieved. Then the road curved past the waterfront one final time. Calder glanced toward Pier 6. Morrow was already back. He sat beside the snow-covered bench exactly where Calder had first seen him after the rescue. The road behind the bench was empty. Still, Morrow watched it. Calder drove another 100 yards. His hand tightened on the steering wheel. The marine watch on his wrist showed he had already lost far more than the hour he intended to spend here. He could still make Portland before dark. He should. There were a dozen reasonable explanations for Silas Reddick's absence, and none of them belonged to Calder. He eased off the accelerator. In the mirror, the dog became smaller. Still waiting. Calder swore quietly. Then he turned the wheel. The pickup rolled into a roadside pull-off overlooking the harbor and came to a stop. Calder shut off the engine. For a while he sat with both hands resting on the steering wheel. "One night," he said to the empty cab. Outside, winter sunlight flashed across the water. One night doesn't mean anything. But down below, beside an old bench at Pier 6, Morrow remained facing the road. And Calder did not start the truck again. By 6 the next morning, Calder Vance was back at the waterfront. He had slept badly in a motel 3 blocks from the harbor, not because the mattress was poor or the pipes rattled whenever someone upstairs ran water, but because he had spent too much of the night being annoyed with himself. He had stayed. That fact bothered him more than it should have. One night, he had told himself. A meaningless delay. A weather stop. A practical decision. Yet before sunrise, he had already pulled on his navy canvas jacket, laced his boots, and walked toward Pier 6 with no luggage packed and no engine warming outside. The sky was clear after the storm, washed pale over the bay. Snow along the rooftops reflected the early light in shades of blue and silver. The harbor had not fully awakened yet. A few deck lights glowed amber through the cold. Somewhere behind the fish houses, a forklift beeped in slow intervals. Morrow was exactly where Calder had expected him to be, beside the bench. The German shepherd sat with his front paws squared beneath him, marine teal harness dark against his black and gold coat. Frost had settled along the outer edge of the wood beside him. His right ear, the one with the slightly bent tip, angled toward every sound coming from the road. Calder stopped several yards away. "You're making a habit of proving me right." Morrow glanced at him once, then returned his attention to the road. That wasn't a compliment. The diner door opened behind Calder. Nora Bellamy came toward him carrying 2 paper cups and wearing a muted cranberry coat over her work clothes. The pencil was already behind her ear despite the hour. "I figured if you were foolish enough to come back this early, you'd at least want coffee." Calder accepted the cup. "Thank you." Careful, that almost sounded friendly. He ignored that. Nora stood beside him and looked toward Morrow. At 6:20, Silas would usually be sitting there. Calder checked his old marine watch without meaning to. 6:17. Nora noticed. 3 minutes early. Wasn't timing him. Of course not. She nodded toward the bench. He always drank it black, burned his tongue half the time because he refused to wait. Morrow would show up a few minutes after that. Every morning? Near enough. What did Silas feed him? Fish, cooked, never raw if he could help it. Nora smiled faintly. Used to tell Morrow he had standards. Calder watched the shepherd. What did he talk to him about? Everything, probably. Silas talks better when the other person can't interrupt. At 6:20, nobody came down the road. Morrow remained seated. Nora's smile faded. Calder took a slow drink. When did you last see Silas? Monday morning. And today's Thursday. Yes. You said yesterday people thought he'd gone somewhere. They did. You included. Nora's gaze moved toward the harbor. I thought Wes had taken him to Rockland. Why? Because Wes mentioned Rockland on Sunday. That's it? She looked back at him. Small towns run on assumptions more than schedules. Calder knew she meant it as an explanation. It sounded like a warning. Wesley Tolland's workshop sat behind a row of boat sheds, half hidden by an old trawler blocked up on timber stands. Morrow led the way there before Calder consciously decided to follow. Not led, exactly. The dog simply rose from Silas's bench around 7, stretched stiffly, and started down the waterfront as though beginning a route he had walked many times. Calder followed because standing beside an empty bench had begun to feel useless. The workshop door was open. Inside, a man with a broad back and a faded brown canvas jacket was bent over an outboard motor clamped to a workstand. He wore navy bib overalls over a dark green flannel shirt. A thick gray mustache hid most of his upper lip, and a pair of small reading glasses hung from a cord around his neck. He looked up when Morrow entered. There you are, Trouble. Morrow crossed the shop and sat beside the heater. The man noticed Calder next. You the one who pulled him out from under 6? Calder Vance. Wes Tolland. They shook hands. Wes's grip was still powerful, though the knuckles of his right hand were swollen and stiff. Calder noticed him flexing it afterward. Wes caught the glance. Arthritis. Don't start. I didn't. Good. Calder looked around. Engine blocks, propellers, coils of line, coffee cans full of bolts. The kind of shop where nothing was thrown away until it had failed at least 3 separate uses. You take Silas to Rockland? Wes frowned. No. Nora thought you did. Nora thinks everybody needs supervision. Where did you think he was? Bangor. Calder paused. Why Bangor? Wes looked toward Morrow, then back to the motor. Said something a while back about a hospital appointment. When? Don't know. Couple weeks ago. He tell you he was going? No. Then why assume he did? Wes stopped turning the wrench. For the first time, irritation gave way to uncertainty. Because he wasn't here. Calder said nothing. Wes disliked the silence immediately. He disappears sometimes. So everyone keeps telling me. He does, goes up the coast, helps somebody with a boat, sleeps wherever he lands. Silas has been 70 years old since he was 40. Morrow stood. He went to a workbench along the far wall, sniffed once beneath it, then settled beside an old stool. Wes watched him. That's where Silas sits when my hand gets bad. Calder looked at Wes's swollen fingers. What does he do? Nothing. Wes's answer came too quickly. Then he sighed. Helps with nets, cleans carburetors when I can't get my fingers around the small screws. He stared at the dog. Never asks if I need help, just finds something that needs doing and does it badly enough that I have to insult him. Calder almost smiled. Efficient system. Worked for 30 years. Morrow rested his chin on one paw. Something shifted in Calder's understanding. Not of Silas, not yet. Of the dog. Morrow had not come here searching randomly. He had come because this was part of Silas's morning, a place on a route, a person on a route. Calder felt a faint unease at the thought. A man could disappear from a town. His habits disappeared more slowly. At Lenora Pike's clinic, the answer Calder got about Morrow complicated things further. Lenora sat behind a small desk with her glasses low on her nose, while an old computer loaded a scanned set of records. She wore slate blue scrubs beneath a charcoal fleece jacket, her short, brown and silver hair curling slightly at the ends. You were right, she said. About training. She rotated the monitor. An old photograph showed a younger Morrow, wearing a bright working harness beside a woman in a life vest near a marina. Civilian search and rescue, coastal unit. Mostly lost person searches around docks, shoreline, cold water incidents, nothing military. Calder studied the photograph. Handler? Marianne Cole. She developed a neurological condition and had to stop working about a year ago. The organization lost funding not long afterward. What happened to him? Transferred to a rescue specializing in retired working dogs. And then? Foster placement. Lenora folded her hands. 3 months ago, a windstorm took down part of the foster family's fence. Morrow got out. How far away? Just under 15 miles. Calder looked at her. He came here. He came back to the waterfront where he used to work. Rescue didn't collect him. They did. Lenora's expression became more complicated. Twice. Calder leaned back. And? First time he stopped eating. Second time he damaged a gate trying to get out. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't unmanageable. He just kept trying to return here. So they left him loose? No. A trace of firmness entered her voice. They agreed to a supervised, temporary arrangement after I offered to coordinate it. Wes gives him shelter when the weather turns. Nora feeds him. I monitor his health. The rescue still owns him legally while they decide what placement makes sense. Calder nodded. That sounded less romantic, which made it more believable. Lenora clicked the photograph closed. He wasn't abandoned, Mr. Vance. I didn't say he was. No, but people like that version of the story. It gives them someone to blame. Calder looked toward the exam room door where Morrow waited outside with June. What's your version? Lenora considered. He went back to a place where he understood the rules. The sentence stayed with Calder longer than he wanted it to, because he understood that instinct too well. Not home, not necessarily. A place where you knew what was expected of you. Sometimes that was close enough. By late morning, Calder had stopped pretending he was merely killing time before Portland. Morrow walked the waterfront with him. The dog did not nose at locked doors or paw at mysterious objects. He simply followed a familiar sequence. Wes's workshop, Nora's diner. A weathered boathouse near the end of the commercial dock. At the diner, Morrow went behind the counter only far enough to lie near a storage door. Nora watched him from the coffee machine. Silas helps unload deliveries when the snow's bad. You ask him to? Never. Pay him? He'd be offended. Calder looked down at Morrow. How many people does this man annoy by helping them? Nora laughed. Most of us. Later, Morrow stopped outside a narrow cottage road entrance beyond the harbor. Nora, who had joined them for part of the walk during her break, nodded toward a small blue house near the end. Dale Harmon lives there. Used to fish full-time. Lungs aren't good anymore. Silas visit him? Every Monday. What for? Ask Silas, and he'd say coffee. Nora shoved her hands deeper into her coat pockets. Last winter, Dale's propane ran low during a freeze. Silas noticed before Dale mentioned it. After that, he started checking. Calder looked toward the quiet house. Dale have family? A sister in Arizona? That was not the same as yes. Calder turned back toward the harbor. All morning, everyone had spoken about Silas as if he were difficult, unreliable, intrusive, impossible. Yet his absence kept revealing things he had been holding together. Not dramatic things. No lives saved, no speeches made, a net repaired, a delivery carried, a fuel tank noticed. Small acts so ordinary, nobody had thought to count them. That was what unsettled Calder. Big rescues announced themselves. Small dependents could hide for years. The first real break came after lunch. Wes found the raincoat. He came out of the boathouse carrying a heavy, dark, pea-green oilskin coat by the shoulders. This is his. Calder touched the sleeve. Dry, cold. How long has it been here? Couldn't tell you. Would he leave town without it in January? Wes's jaw shifted. No. Nora arrived 10 minutes later holding an old flip phone. Found this charging under the counter. Wes swore. Calder took the phone. Battery full, no password, no useful messages beyond a few old calls. Then Wes went quiet. He disappeared back toward his boat and returned with a small white prescription bottle. Found it in his other jacket. Calder read the label. Cardiac medication. Silas Reddick. The three objects sat together on a bait cleaning table. Raincoat, phone, medication. No one spoke for several seconds. The harbor continued around them. Engines, gulls, a winch whining somewhere offshore. Ordinary sounds. Calder looked at Nora. You thought he was with Wes? She nodded. He looked at Wes. You thought Bangor. Wes stared at the bottle. Yeah. June arrived from the harbor office with a folder tucked under one arm. I thought he was writing out the weather somewhere. Calder looked at all three of them. And nobody actually knew. June's face tightened. No. The answer landed differently now. Morrow stood beside the table. He did not bark. He did not perform. He simply looked toward the empty road leading into town. Calder suddenly understood what had kept bothering him since morning. Everyone here knew Silas. No one had known he was missing. There was a difference, and it mattered. June was back in the harbor office by late afternoon, working through inspection paperwork for Pier 6 when Calder entered. The office smelled faintly of wet wool and printer toner. A tide chart covered one wall. On the desk were engineering notices, liability forms, and a red folder marked Pier 6, Restricted Access. June did not look up immediately. Please tell me you didn't crawl under anything else. Calder placed Silas's phone on the desk. That got her attention. Then the prescription bottle. Then he laid the folded raincoat over the empty chair beside him. June stared at the three items. The humor disappeared from her face. He could have taken another coat. Yes. Could have forgotten the phone. Yes. Could have had extra medication. Possible. June looked up. Calder's voice remained quiet. But all three? She leaned back slowly. Outside the office window, Morrow sat on the snow near the harbor office steps, facing the waterfront. June closed the Pier 6 folder. What are you saying? Calder had spent most of his life learning not to overstate what evidence could support, so he did not say something bad had happened. He did not say Silas was hurt. He did not say the dog knew. He only said what they now knew. He's not off somewhere having a good time. June was silent. Calder pushed the phone a few inches closer to her. He's missing. For several seconds, nothing moved in the room. Then June reached for the landline. Not dramatically, no panic. Just a decision finally made. She called the local sheriff's office first, then the regional hospital network, then the harbor contacts Silas sometimes worked with. Across Port Cormorant, questions began moving from one person to another. When did you last see him? Did he mention Bangor? Did he take a bus? Did he board anyone's boat? Had anyone checked his apartment? For 3 days, Silas Reddick had been absent. That afternoon, for the first time, the town stopped explaining his absence and started looking for him. Outside, Morrow remained by the steps until Calder came out. The dog rose when he saw him. Calder looked toward Pier 6, then toward the road south. Portland was still there. The job was still waiting. But for the first time since arriving, Calder did not calculate how many hours he had lost. He bent down, clipped a temporary lead Lenora had given him to Morrow's worn harness, and said, "Come on." Morrow stepped beside him, not ahead, beside. And together they walked back toward the harbor. By Friday morning, Silas Reddick had officially become a missing person. That changed the language around Port Cormorant. People stopped saying he was probably somewhere. They started saying when they had last seen him. A deputy checked the bus station records. Another called motels along the coastal highway. June sent Silas's description to harbor offices from Rockland to Belfast. The sheriff's department contacted regional hospitals, while someone else went through the list of boats Silas occasionally worked aboard. None of it produced an immediate answer. The waiting irritated Calder more than uncertainty usually did. He understood emergencies. Emergencies had shape, noise, sequence, secure the scene, identify the problem, do the next useful thing. A missing 71-year-old fisherman who might have boarded a bus, taken a ride, slept on a boat, or collapsed somewhere between all three offered no such order. At 8:13, Calder's phone rang. Portland. He watched the screen until the call nearly went to voicemail, then he answered. Vance? A man named Peter from the research vessel asked whether he was still arriving that afternoon. Calder looked through the motel window toward the harbor. Snow had begun sliding from the roof across the street in slow, heavy sheets. Truck's acting up, he said. The lie arrived easily. Too easily. Peter asked what kind of problem. Electrical. Calder hated himself slightly for choosing something plausible. You need another day? Shouldn't be more than that. All right, tomorrow then. Calder ended the call. Morrow lay on the motel room floor near the heater, temporary lead coiled beside him. Lenora had agreed Calder could keep him overnight rather than sending him back to the boathouse while the search continued. The shepherd lifted his head. Calder stared at him. Don't. Morrow blinked. I know the truck is fine. The tail moved once against the carpet. Calder shoved the phone into his pocket. For years he had built his life around leaving before anyone could interpret his presence as a promise. Now he was lying to a man in Portland because an old fisherman he had never met was missing. That was new. He did not yet know whether it was progress or stupidity. June found him at Pier 6 an hour later. She was carrying a clipboard beneath one arm and arguing into her radio about salt delivery. When the call ended, she looked at Calder's boots. You planning to keep standing around looking useful, or do you actually want to be useful? That invitation could use work. You stayed. So did the pier. Barely. She handed him a spare reflective vest. Calder looked at it. "What am I doing?" "Walking the accessible sections with me. I need eyes on loose decking and damaged rail after the snow load." "I'm not your engineer." "No. But you know the difference between old and dangerous." "Sometimes." June started walking. "That's more than half the council." Morrow fell into step beside Calder. They worked slowly along the inner harbor, checking hinges, ladders, cleats, and visible storm damage. Calder kept his observations narrow. A split board here, a loose fastening there. Nothing that required pretending he knew the full structural condition. Pier 6 was different. Even from the safe section, he could see years written into it. Timbers repaired beside older repairs. New bolts driven into old wood. Railings replaced in sections rather than as a whole. The structure had not failed because nobody cared. It had survived because people had cared in pieces. That was not the same thing. June crouched beside a post and marked something on her clipboard. "How long has the town been trying to fund this?" "Proper rebuild? 7 years." 7? First estimate was ugly. Second was worse. A voice behind them said, "And the third one will tell you to burn the whole damn thing and sell postcards." Wes approached, carrying a thermos, his broad figure wrapped in the same brown duck canvas jacket Calder had seen in the workshop. Beside him walked a man Calder had not met, late 40s, lean, clean-shaven, dark wool overcoat buttoned high against the cold, rectangular glasses, oxblood leather folio under one arm. The newcomer stepped carefully over an icy patch and looked down at Pier 6 with the expression of a man who disliked seeing numbers turned into weather. June sighed. Perfect timing. Wes lifted his thermos. "I brought sunshine." June nodded toward the other man. "Calder Vance, Martin Keene, Town Risk Management." Martin offered his hand. His grip was brief and professional. "You're the man who went under the pier for the dog." "I was available." Martin glanced at the restricted section. "You were also trespassing." Wes gave a dry laugh. "There, you two are friends already." Martin ignored him. Calder did not dislike the man. That almost made the next 20 minutes worse. Martin opened his folio and explained the current position plainly. Liability coverage for the public waterfront had increased. Emergency repairs were consuming maintenance money meant for other facilities. A full Pier 6 rebuild would cost more than the town could currently justify. "If we keep it partially open," Martin said, "we accept the possibility that somebody decides a barricade is a suggestion." Wes stared at him. "You mean people who work there." "I mean anyone." "You close 6. Where do Pete Lawson and the Mercer brothers dock?" "The commercial marina has vacancies." "At nearly triple the seasonal rate." Martin adjusted his glasses. "I know." "No, you know the number. That's not the same thing." June stepped between them before volume became argument. "Wes?" "What?" "You're yelling at the one person here who didn't set the marina rates." Wes looked away. Martin closed the folio halfway. "I don't want people priced off the waterfront." "Then stop trying to shut it down." "I'm trying to stop somebody falling through it." Calder watched the three of them. He had expected, without admitting it, to recognize the shape of the conflict quickly. Somebody unreasonable, somebody greedy, somebody sentimental enough to endanger everyone else. Instead, every side made sense. Martin had liability reports, June had public safety, Wes had men whose livelihoods depended on the cheap dock space. The discomfort came from the absence of a villain. Calder had spent enough years around emergencies to know that the hardest problems often began when every person involved had a reasonable reason for what they wanted. Wes pointed toward the marina across the inlet. "You know what happens if those guys move over there? First bad month, they're done. Boat gets sold. Then one more person disappears from this harbor." Martin's expression hardened. "And if this pier gives way under 3 men, what exactly have we preserved?" Nobody answered. A gull landed on the railing beyond them, waited, then lifted again into the cold. Morrow watched it go. Calder realized he had been waiting for somebody to win the argument. No one did. Later that morning, Morrow wandered toward the boathouse road instead of returning to Silas's bench. Calder let him. Not because he believed the dog was tracking anything. That idea had already become too easy, too tempting. Morrow was following memory, not evidence. At the end of a narrow side road stood a small weathered building with blue-gray siding and a shallow porch facing the water. Morrow stopped there. An older man sat just inside the open boathouse door beside a portable propane heater. He was thinner than Wes, with a narrow chest and white hair visible beneath a knit cap. An oxygen cannula rested beneath his nose, the tube disappearing toward a small concentrator near his chair. He looked at Morrow first, then Calder. "Well," he said, "Silas send you?" Calder felt something shift. "No." The man's face changed, only slightly. "You Calder?" "That depends who's asking." "Dale Harmon." He gestured toward an overturned crate. "Sit down before you wear a hole in the snow." Calder stayed standing for another moment, then accepted. Morrow settled near the heater. Dale watched the dog. "Silas comes by Mondays." "For what?" "Coffee." "That what he says?" Dale gave a dry, breathy laugh. "You've met him?" "Not yet." "Then you already understand him." Dale leaned back carefully. "Last winter I ran low on propane. Didn't notice how low until the furnace started cycling wrong. Silas did." "How?" "He saw I was wearing my coat indoors." Calder looked toward the heater. "Since then?" "Every Monday he finds an excuse to come by." "To check your propane." "To complain about my coffee." Dale's mouth twitched. Same thing, really. Morrow lifted his head as Dale reached down and rubbed his neck. "He brings this one sometimes." "Silas ever talk about Banger?" Dale thought. "No. But he doesn't talk about doctors unless they're somebody else's." Calder nodded. That sounded increasingly consistent. When he stood to leave, Dale said, "If you find him, tell him I've got plenty of propane." Calder turned. Dale's expression had gone quiet. "Tell him anyway." The words stayed with Calder as he walked back toward town. There was no heroism in what Silas had been doing. That was the point. He had noticed Dale wearing a coat indoors. Then he had remembered. For months. Calder had spent much of his life associating care with intervention. The flare in the dark, the call over radio, the boat turning hard toward trouble. Silas's version was smaller, and maybe harder. Notice, return, notice again. No medal, no report, no clean moment when the job was done. That afternoon, Calder found Wes alone in the workshop. Morrow moved directly to the heater. Wes was cleaning a carburetor with exaggerated concentration. "Dale tell you his life story?" "Propane." Wes snorted. "Sounds like Dale." Calder leaned against the bench. "You said Silas helps when your hand gets bad." "Sometimes." "Anything else?" Wes did not answer. Calder waited. Silence worked differently on men like Wes than questions did. Eventually, Wes set the carburetor down. "My wife died 4 years ago." Calder had not known. He said nothing. "Cancer. Took about 9 months from diagnosis to the funeral." Wes rubbed his thumb across a grease stain on the bench. "Afterward, everybody brought food for 2 weeks. Casseroles, pies, soup. Then people had lives to get back to." He shrugged. "That's normal." Calder understood the word as defense rather than judgment. Wes continued. "Silas never brought anything." "Nothing?" "Nope." For the first time, Wes smiled. He'd put stuff in my refrigerator when I wasn't looking. Calder glanced at him. Subtle. Terrible at it. First time, half a meatloaf appeared. Asked him where it came from. He said Nora made too much. And? Nora hadn't made meatloaf in 6 months. Calder laughed quietly. Wes looked embarrassed by his own memory. Next week, stew. Week after that, fish chowder. Always somebody else made too much. He resumed cleaning the carburetor. Never asked if I was doing okay. Would you have answered? No. There you go. Wes pointed the screwdriver at him. Don't get wise. But the exchange left Calder unsettled in a different way. Silas had known something that Calder had never learned during all those years of formal rescue work. Sometimes asking a person whether he needed help only gave him another chance to say no. So Silas had stopped asking. He had simply arrived with too much food. Calder looked across the workshop at Morrow. The dog had watched these routes, these visits, these repeated acts. No one had designed a network, but one existed anyway. And Silas had been moving through it like thread. Now the thread was gone. Only the shape remained. Calder thought of his own life. Phone numbers accumulated in old devices. People he had worked beside for years and never called once the job ended. Men whose birthdays he did not know. Women who could probably tell you exactly how he took his coffee, but had no idea where he lived now. For most of his adult life, Calder had divided the world neatly. There were the people doing the rescuing, and the people needing rescue. One stood, one was pulled up. One returned to work, the other went home. Simple. Port Cormorant was beginning to make that division feel childish. Maybe there was a third kind of person. Someone who noticed the heat was low. Someone who left food without asking. Someone who remembered a chair should not remain empty too long. No sirens, no heroics, just attention. He did not know why that idea bothered him so much. Perhaps because attention worked both ways. If you noticed people long enough, eventually they noticed you. His phone rang again near dusk. Portland. Calder stepped outside the workshop. Peter asked if the electrical problem was fixed. Calder looked at his pickup parked across the road. Perfectly functional. Need one more day. A pause. You sure you still want the job? Calder looked toward the harbor. Morrow had followed him outside and stood near his leg. Yes. The answer came after half a second too long. Peter noticed. Call me tomorrow. The line disconnected. Calder lowered the phone. Morrow looked up at him. Mind your business. The shepherd sneezed. Calder almost laughed. Then June's radio crackled from across the waterfront. He saw her stop halfway down the harbor office steps. She listened. Turned toward Calder. Something in her posture made him move before she called his name. By the time he reached her, she had taken the radio away from her mouth. State Police got a match. Wes came out behind him. Nora appeared in the diner doorway. June continued. Hospital in Bangor admitted a man 3 days ago after he collapsed at a bus stop outside Augusta. Calder felt the whole waterfront contract around the sentence. Silas? June nodded. They confirmed him through medical records. Wes let out a breath that sounded almost angry. Why the hell didn't anyone call? They tried the emergency contact on file. June swallowed. Number belonged to Harold Fenwick. Nora's face fell. Harold died 6 years ago. June nodded. The hospital had Silas's identity. They just didn't have anyone current to notify. For a moment, nobody spoke. All the assumptions from the last 3 days became suddenly visible. Not negligence, not cruelty. Gaps. One person thought another person knew. A hospital had a name, but no living contact. A town had dozens of people who would have come immediately, but no formal place for any of them on a form. Morrow had been lying near the harbor office door. At the sound of June's voice, he rose. No bark, no sudden display. He simply stood and looked at Calder, body alert, as if the change in the humans around him had changed the room. June took out her keys. "I'm going to Bangor." Calder looked at Morrow, then at the road. This time he did not think about Portland at all. Bangor looked nothing like Port Cormorant. There was no salt on the wind, no rigging tapping against masts, no dark water moving beyond the buildings. The hospital rose out of a gray-white morning of plowed streets and packed snow, all glass, concrete, and fluorescent light. Calder disliked it immediately. Not because there was anything wrong with the place, because hospitals had their own kind of helplessness. Everything happened behind doors. Everything depended on somebody else telling you when you could move. June parked near the main entrance and shut off the engine. Morrow sat upright in the back seat, wearing the same repaired marine teal harness. He had been quiet for most of the drive, but since they entered Bangor, his attention had sharpened. His nose worked continuously at the crack between the seats. "You sure about bringing him in?" June asked. Calder looked back. Lenora cleared it with the rescue. That had taken 2 phone calls before dawn. The organization still legally responsible for Morrow had agreed to the trip under Calder's direct supervision, partly because Lenora had vouched for him, and partly because separating the dog from the situation now seemed more stressful than allowing the visit. June studied Calder. "I meant you." Calder opened the door. "No." It was the most honest answer he had given all week. A nurse met them on the cardiac floor. She was middle-aged, tired-eyed, and practical enough not to make a performance out of the German shepherd walking beside Calder. "Mr. Reddick's stable," she told them. "He's been asking when he can leave." June made a sound that was halfway between relief and annoyance. "That sounds like him." They followed her down a quiet hall. Morrow changed before they reached the room. It was subtle. His stride lengthened, his head came up. The slightly bent tip of his right ear angled forward. Calder felt the lead tighten, not with a pull, but with intention. "Morrow." The shepherd glanced at him. "Easy." The door at the end of the hall opened as a staff member stepped out. Morrow saw into the room. His whole body went still. Then he moved. Not a lunge, not the frantic burst Calder had half expected. 3 fast steps, then restraint. He stopped beside the bed as though some older training had risen through him and reminded him that hospitals were not docks and sick men were not search targets. Silas Reddick looked smaller than Calder had imagined. 71, narrow through the shoulders, with silver-white hair pushed untidily back from a weathered face, and a short pale beard that made the hollows in his cheeks look deeper. A hospital gown replaced the heavy fisherman's clothes Calder associated with him only through other people's descriptions. But the eyes were alive, gray-green, sharp, annoyed. Until he saw Morrow. Something in Silas's face came apart, not dramatically. His jaw loosened. The irritation left his eyes. He reached one hand toward the dog. Morrow stepped close enough to rest his head on the edge of the mattress. Silas's fingers moved slowly behind his left ear. "You damn fool," he whispered. Morrow closed his eyes. Silas swallowed. "I told you not to wait." Calder felt irritation rise before he understood why. He looked away toward the window. 3 days. The bench. The cold. The dog watching every road into the harbor, and this man had known exactly what Morrow would do. June moved to the other side of the bed. "You could have called somebody." Silas's expression rebuilt itself quickly. "Good morning to you, too." "Silas, I'm alive. That isn't an answer. It's the important part. June stared at him. Silas stared back. Calder had known June only a few days, but he had already learned that she did not waste energy on arguments she could postpone. She pulled a chair closer and sat. Doctor first. Then I decide how angry I am. You deciding for the town now? Only the loud parts. For the first time, Silas smiled. Barely. Morrow kept his head against the mattress. The cardiologist arrived 20 minutes later and explained the situation with enough plain language that Silas could not pretend not to understand. The problem was not an immediate catastrophe. That seemed to irritate Silas almost as much as bad news would have. There was an irregular rhythm and evidence of reduced cardiac function that required medication adjustment, follow-up testing, and temporary restrictions on strenuous work until they knew more. No solo offshore work, the doctor said. Silas looked at the ceiling. For now, she added. How long is for now? Until cardiology clears you. That sounds suspiciously like no answer. It's the answer you have. Calder almost liked her. The doctor left instructions with June and stepped out. Silence settled over the room. Silas scratched gently under Morrow's chin. Calder finally asked, Why Bangor? Silas did not look at him. Cardiology referral. You knew you had an appointment? Yes. When? Tuesday. June sat forward. You left Monday night? Early Tuesday. Without telling anyone? Silas sighed. There it is again. What? That tone people use when they discover an adult has done something without permission? June's expression hardened. This isn't about permission. It becomes permission the second people know you're sick. Calder watched him. Silas continued before June could answer. Wes would have taken my truck keys. Nora would have packed enough food for a lumber camp. You would have called 3 different doctors to check whether mine knew what he was doing. June crossed her arms. And apparently all of that would have been worse than collapsing at a bus stop. Silas's mouth tightened. He had no answer for that. Calder did. You left your phone. Silas looked at him. Charging at Nora's. Your coat was at the boathouse. I had another. Heart medication was on Wes's boat. I had enough in my pocket. Wallet? Silas glanced toward the bedside cabinet. Lost when the ambulance crew moved me. Transit police found it yesterday. There it was. No conspiracy, no hidden reason. Just enough minor mistakes stacked together to turn a private medical appointment into 3 days of confusion. Calder found that somehow more frustrating. A person did not have to make one terrible decision to disappear. Sometimes he only had to make 5 ordinary ones. June rubbed a hand over her face. Why not tell one person? Silas looked toward the window. Snow slid down the glass in melting streaks. His answer came quieter. Because I wanted to know what the doctor said before everybody decided my life for me. The room changed. Calder heard it immediately. Not stubbornness alone, fear. Silas kept talking. You tell fishermen you've got a heart problem. They don't hear appointment. They hear done. June's face softened, but she did not interrupt. My boat's old, Silas said. So am I. I know the math. He looked down at his hands. The fingers were rope-scarred, knuckles enlarged by age and decades of cold. But I wanted the math to be mine first. Calder understood that, more than he wanted to. By afternoon, discharge planning had replaced medical uncertainty. That should have made things easier. Instead, Silas announced that he was not going back to Port Cormorant. June thought she had misheard him. You're what? Not going back yet. Where are you going? There's a furnished room near here. Hospital social worker gave me a list. You have a home. I have an apartment. You have a harbor full of people trying to find you. Silas looked irritated. That's exactly the problem. Calder, standing near the window, turned. Silas continued. Pier 6 is halfway to the bottom already. My boat needs more work than it's worth. Wes's hands barely close some mornings. Dale ought to have moved south 5 winters ago. June stared at him. So, because everyone's getting older, you're leaving? Because I know what comes next. What? People start helping. The bitterness in the words surprised Calder. Silas looked at Morrow. First they drive you places, then they carry things, then they ask whether you should still be doing something you've done your whole life. That's what people do when they care whether you drop dead, June said. Silas shook his head. Then one day you're the reason everybody has to change plans. The sentence sat heavily in the room. Calder looked at him differently. Silas was not afraid of dying, not primarily. He was afraid of becoming weight. That was why he helped before anyone asked. That was why he never asked himself. A man could spend decades making himself indispensable to others and still have no idea what to do when the direction of care reversed. June got up. I'm going for coffee before I say something unhelpful. Bring me one. No. She left. Silas looked satisfied with himself. Calder was suddenly furious. Quietly. Which was worse. He stood at the window for several seconds, looking down at the parking lot where snow had been pushed into gray ridges along the curb. Then he said, You made a dog sit at a frozen pier for 3 days because you decided nobody needed to know where you were. Silas's expression hardened. Morrow had shelter. That's not what I said. He knows the boathouse. He wasn't waiting at the boathouse. Silas looked at the dog. Morrow lay beside the bed now, chin across his paws. He'll adjust. Calder turned. No. Silas met his eyes. Calder's voice stayed level. That dog climbed back to the same bench every morning. He was tangled under Pier 6 because he kept returning to the waterfront. After we cut him loose, first thing he did was go back to your chair. Silas's jaw worked once. He'll get used to me being gone. No, he won't. Calder surprised himself with the certainty of it. Silas looked away. You don't know him. Neither do you, apparently. That landed. Calder regretted it almost immediately, but he did not take it back. For a while, the only sound was hospital ventilation. Then Silas said, Maybe that's the problem. Calder waited. Silas rubbed his thumb slowly along one of Morrow's ears. He had a job once. Calder said nothing. Lenora told me some of it. Search work, water, docks. Silas looked down at the dog. Knew where to stand. Knew what people wanted from him. Then that went away. His voice softened. He showed up at the harbor and acted like he was waiting for somebody to hand him instructions. Calder thought of Morrow responding instantly beneath the pier, stay, up, old commands reaching through fear. Silas continued, I started feeding him because he looked too proud to beg. A faint smile appeared. Recognized that. Calder leaned against the window frame. Silas's eyes stayed on Morrow. Maybe he's like me. Had a place, had work, knew exactly where he was supposed to be. The smile disappeared. Then one day nobody needed the job anymore. Calder felt something inside him go still. He had spent the last several days believing he was learning about Silas. Instead, the old man had just described him. The uniforms had gone first, then the formal duty, then the jobs in which people called Calder because something had already gone wrong. He had told himself that leaving before people depended on him was freedom. Maybe it was simply another version of Silas taking a bus alone. 3 lives, different histories, same accounting system. Useful meant necessary, Necessary meant worth keeping. When the work ended, everything underneath became harder to name. Calder looked toward Morrow. "What happens if you're wrong?" he asked. Silas frowned. "About what?" "That usefulness is the price of admission." Silas did not answer. Calder did not have one either. That was why the question stayed. June returned with 2 coffees and 1 tea. Silas complained about the tea. That seemed to improve the room. An hour later, the nurse came in to review discharge instructions and mentioned that Morrow would need to leave the floor while transport arrangements were finalized. Calder stood. "Come on, buddy." Morrow rose. Silas did not look at him. Calder walked the shepherd toward the door. They were nearly into the hallway when Silas spoke. "Wait." Calder stopped. Morrow turned first. Silas was staring at the dog. The old fisherman looked suddenly tired, in a way that had nothing to do with his heart. He exhaled through his nose. "Damn animal." Morrow's tail moved once. Silas looked at Calder. Not June. Calder. Perhaps because Calder had not asked him to promise anything. Perhaps because Calder understood too well what it cost to choose attachment when leaving would be easier. "I'll go back," Silas said. June stayed completely still. Calder nodded once. No victory, no speech, just acknowledgement. Silas pointed at him. "Don't look pleased." "I'm not." "You are." "That might be the medication." Silas stared at him, then laughed once to spite himself. Morrow crossed back to the bed and pressed his head beneath Silas's hand. This time Silas did not tell him not to wait. Silas Reddick came home to weather warnings. By the time June's truck rolled back into Port Cormorant, a winter storm watch had already been posted for the Maine coast. The morning sky was still bright in places, but a broad bank of gray had gathered offshore, flattening the light over the harbor and turning the water from steel blue to something darker. Silas noticed it before anyone said a word. He stepped out of the truck slowly, one hand braced on the doorframe. "Wind's turning." June shut her door. "You've been home 12 seconds. Still got eyes. You also have discharge instructions. That doesn't make the sky less gray." Calder opened the rear door. Morrow jumped down, landed lightly, then circled once around Silas before settling at his side. Silas looked down. "You're making this embarrassing." Morrow leaned against his leg. That was the welcome. The human version came a minute later. Nora pushed through the diner door, carrying a paper bag large enough to feed 4 people. She crossed the snow without hurrying, though her face had already betrayed the relief she was trying not to show. "You look terrible," she said. Silas took the bag. "What's in it?" "Food." That narrows it down. "Soup, bread, 2 sandwiches, something you can freeze." "I own groceries." "I've seen your groceries." Wes arrived from the direction of his workshop, with both hands shoved into his brown canvas jacket. He stopped 10 feet away. "You idiot." Silas looked at him. "Good to see you, too." "You could have called." "Didn't have my phone." "You left it under Nora's counter." That would explain it. Wes's jaw tightened. For a second, Calder thought the older man might say what he actually felt. He didn't. Instead, he pointed toward Silas's chest. "You die before paying me for that fuel pump. I'm selling your boat." Silas nodded. "There he is." Wes turned away too quickly. Morrow followed him with his eyes. Calder understood now what Silas had been doing for years. Not avoiding affection, translating it. In Port Cormorant, concern often arrived disguised as insult, food, or unsolicited repairs. June waited until everyone had finished pretending Silas's return was ordinary. Then she spoke. "One condition." Silas closed his eyes. Here we go. No solo boat work until cardiology clears it. I'm not dead. No one said you were. Then stop treating me like cargo. June did not raise her voice. That's the condition. Silas looked at Calder as if expecting support. Calder adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Don't drag me into this. Coward. Alive coward. Nora laughed. Silas muttered something under his breath, then finally said, Fine. June nodded once. No speech, no congratulations. The agreement mattered more because nobody tried to make it symbolic. For a few hours, the harbor settled. Then Martin Keene arrived with paperwork. He walked into the harbor office shortly before noon, carrying his oxblood folio under one arm and a weather service printout in the other. The incoming system had strengthened. Gusts were expected to exceed 50 miles per hour along exposed sections of the coast, with heavy snow followed by a brief period of mixed precipitation near the waterline. High tide would arrive late that evening. Martin placed the forecast on June's desk. I want Pier 6 closed before 3. June looked up. All of it? All public access beyond the inner gate. Wes, who had followed Martin inside after seeing his car, reacted immediately. You can't do that today. Martin turned. I can recommend it. And she can sign it, Wes said, pointing at June. June leaned back in her chair. Correct. Wes looked between them. There are 3 boats still moving gear. Pete's got traps stored near the outer shed. Lawson's compressor is out there. Mercer still has 2 bins he needs off before the storm. Martin opened his folio. Then they have 3 hours. That's not enough. It's what the weather gives us. No, it's what you give us. Martin's expression stayed controlled. The weather does not negotiate with dock schedules. Wes laughed once, without humor. That line sounded better in your head. Martin ignored him. Calder stood near the window with Morrow lying beside his boots. The argument had changed since the last time. Before, Pier 6 had been a question of future policy. Now the storm had put a clock on it. Wes was not defending nostalgia. He was thinking about equipment, boats, people who could not absorb another financial hit. Martin was not trying to win. He was looking at a forecast and calculating exposure. June stared down at the paperwork. Her responsibility was the worst of the 3 because her decision would hurt someone regardless of what she chose. What's Elias say? She asked. Hasn't seen it today, Martin replied. Then I want eyes on the structure before I sign a full closure. Martin nodded. That's fair. Wes threw up both hands. So now we wait for another clipboard. Calder finally spoke. Or we use the time to move what we can. Wes looked at him. That your solution? No. What is? I don't have one. The admission silenced the room for a beat. Calder continued. But yelling at the forecast isn't one either. Wes stared at him, then swore under his breath and left. June picked up her radio. Come on, Vance. Calder looked down at Morrow. The shepherd was already standing. The accessible section of Pier 6 felt different under the changing weather. Wind had begun moving across the harbor in harder pulses, blowing loose snow in thin sheets between buildings. Mooring lines creaked. Metal hardware knocked irregularly against hulls. Calder and June walked the perimeter while 2 deckhands began shifting equipment inland. Morrow stayed close. Near the section where Calder had first found him trapped, the dog slowed. Calder noticed because everything about Morrow's movement changed at once. The shepherd's head lowered. His ears came forward. His weight shifted back rather than ahead. Then he stepped toward a narrow gap between the planks. Stopped. Backed away. June saw it. What's he doing? Not sure. Morrow approached again. This time his nose did not go to the wood. He listened. Calder did the same. At first there was only harbor noise. Wind, rigging, water. Then, clang. Not loud. Metal striking something below. Several seconds later, another sound followed. A low wooden complaint. Not a crack. More like pressure passing through old timber. Calder crouched. Morrow remained behind him instead of moving closer. That interested him more than if the dog had barked. Calder looked through the gap. The tide had risen high enough that water surged around the pilings. One diagonal brace below had a metal strap at its end, and the strap was moving slightly with each pulse of water. He changed angle. "June." She crouched beside him. "What?" "See the third pile from the outer brace?" She narrowed her eyes. "Maybe?" "Line it against the piling behind it." June shifted. Then she saw it. "That leaning?" "I think so." "How much?" "Enough that I don't remember it looking that way 2 days ago." June stood immediately. She did not say the pier was failing. She did not make an announcement. She picked up her radio. "Harbor to Crowell. You anywhere near town?" Static. Then a voice. 10 minutes out." "Make it Pier 6. Elias Crowell arrived in 11. He came down the waterfront carrying a waterproof survey notebook and wearing a forest gray field jacket under a high-visibility vest. Tall and spare, with wind-ruffled salt and pepper hair, he had the expression of a man who distrusted both panic and optimism equally. He listened to Calder's explanation once, then ignored everyone and inspected the pier. For nearly 40 minutes, nobody got a useful answer. Elias checked the accessible deck, examined visible connections, used binoculars from the shore, then coordinated with June to inspect the underside from a safer, lateral position. Wes hovered nearby. Martin stayed back. Silas, despite explicit instructions to rest, appeared with Nora 10 minutes into the inspection. June saw him and pointed toward the shore. "You're not coming out here." "I wasn't planning to." "You are standing inside the barricade." "I'm supervising badly." Nora pulled him back by the sleeve. Elias finally returned. He removed one glove and opened his notebook. "Outer pile group is moved." Wes's face hardened. "How bad?" "Bad enough." "That isn't a number." "It's the number you're getting without instruments I don't have here." Elias pointed toward the water. "Ice scouring has reduced support around at least 2 piles. One crossbrace is cracked near the connection. Under normal low-load conditions, the remaining structure may hold." "May?" Martin repeated. Elias looked at him. Engineering is full of that word. Then he turned toward June. "If the forecast holds, wind, high tide, wave action, I would not put people on the outer section." Wes crossed his arms. "You saying it's coming down?" "No." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying I wouldn't stand there tonight." That was the sentence that ended the argument for June. She took the closure form from Martin, signed it. "Outer Pier 6 is closed effective now." Wes stared at her. "June, no. We still have gear out there." "Then we move what can be moved from the safe section. Nobody crosses the red line." "You're killing this pier over something that might happen." June's face tightened. "I'm keeping people off something that might fail." "Same damn thing." "No, Wes, it isn't." His anger flashed, not theatrical, tired. "You know how long we've been asking the town to fix those piles?" "Yes." "How many budgets?" "I know." "How many times did they patch one piece and call it maintenance?" "I know." "And now because it got dangerous enough to embarrass somebody, suddenly safety matters?" Martin looked away. That told Calder Wes had struck something real. June did not defend the town. She simply said, "You're right about all of that." Wes stopped. "And I'm still closing it." That was harder to argue with. Calder picked up a coil of line from the safe side. "Tell me what needs moving." Wes looked at him. "I don't need help." Calder lifted the coil. "Good. Then I'm stealing." Wes stared for half a second, then pointed toward a tool chest. "That first." No reconciliation, no surrender. They worked. Sometimes that was enough. By dusk, the harbor had emptied. Snow came sideways. Calder had checked into the same motel again, though this time he did not bother inventing a reason for himself. Morrow lay near the heater, exhausted from the day. Silas was at home under Nora's threat of bodily removal if he tried to go to the waterfront. Wes had finally left his workshop. June remained on duty. Calder stood near the motel window watching the storm erase the road. At 11:48 p.m., he heard it, even from 3 blocks away. A deep sound carried through the wind. Wood giving up. Not an explosion. Not a crash dramatic enough to shake windows. A long fracture followed by a heavy, hollow impact from the direction of the harbor. Morrow's head came up. Calder was already pulling on his boots. By the time he reached the waterfront, June's truck lights were cutting through the snow. No one was on the pier. That was the first thing he checked. The second was the outer section. Part of Pier 6 was gone. Not all of it. The inner structure still stood. The old bench near the entrance remained where it had always been. But beyond the closure gate, 20 or 30 feet of deck had broken away and collapsed into the dark water. One railing hung at an angle. Broken timbers moved with the tide. Snow fell into the empty space. June stood beside Calder. Neither spoke. There was nothing useful to say. The storm had made the decision that the town had been postponing for years. Morning came bright. That almost felt insulting. The storm moved offshore before dawn, leaving Port Cormorant under a hard blue sky. Fresh snow covered every roof, and sunlight glittered across the harbor as if nothing had happened. People gathered behind the barricades. Nobody crossed them. Wes stood at the shoreline with his hands buried in his jacket pockets. Calder watched him from a distance before June walked over. She stopped beside Wes. He did not look at her. For a long time, neither said anything. The missing part of Pier 6 looked smaller in daylight. That made it worse. You could see exactly how ordinary the loss was. A few pilings, deck boards, railings. Nothing that should have carried the weight of so many lives. Wes finally spoke. "If that pier goes, those guys go too." June looked toward the boats tied farther down the harbor. "Some of them." "Pete can't afford the private marina." "I know." "Mercer barely made fuel last month." "I know." Wes kicked gently at the snow. "So what was the point?" June turned toward him. "Of closing it?" He shook his head. "Of being right." June studied the broken pier. "I don't think any of us were." That seemed to surprise him. She continued, "But we kept people off it last night." Wes nodded once. The anger had not disappeared. It had simply run out of somewhere useful to go. After another silence, he said, "If 6 is done, some of those men are going to disappear with it." June looked toward the waterfront buildings, then toward the small clusters of fishermen already talking behind them. "Then we figure out how not to let that happen." Wes finally looked at her. Calder heard the shift in the sentence. Not rebuild the pier. Not save the old structure at any cost. Something else. Morrow walked up beside Calder and sat. The shepherd looked toward the broken water line where he had once been trapped. Then he turned away from it, toward the people. Calder followed his gaze. For the first time, Pier 6 no longer seemed like the center of the problem. It was only the place where the problem had become impossible to ignore. 3 days after the storm, Pier 6 looked less dramatic and more expensive. That was worse. The broken outer section had been fenced off with new barriers, and orange mesh now ran across the approach where fishermen had once moved traps and fuel cans without thinking about it. The tide pushed pieces of splintered decking against the remaining pilings, knocking them together with a dull, repetitive sound. Elias Crowell stood at the shoreline with his waterproof notebook open. "No reopening this season," he said. Wes Tollin stared at the damaged pier. "That your engineering term?" "It is today." Elias pointed toward the outer support line. "You've got compromised piles, damaged bracing, and too much uncertainty below the waterline. Best case, substantial repair. Worst case, partial removal before reconstruction." Martin Keene adjusted his glasses. "And the town can't fund a full rebuild this fiscal year?" Nobody argued with that. The numbers had already been circulated. They were bad enough that even Wes had stopped insulting them. June stood with both hands in the pockets of her harbor jacket, eyes moving from the broken pier to the boats farther down the waterfront. "So we close it long term." Martin nodded. "For public access, yes." Wes turned toward him. This time there was no explosion, no accusation, no anger sharp enough to hide behind. "What happens to the people using it?" Martin's expression changed slightly. It was the first time Calder had heard Wes ask the question that way. Not what happens to the pier. What happens to the people? Martin closed the folio in his hands. "We can look at temporary berthing options. At what price? I don't know yet. Then some of them are done." Martin was quiet. Wes looked back at the water. "Pete's barely covering fuel. Mercer's engine eats money every time he starts it. Dale doesn't fish anymore. But you close everything down here and he'll stop coming at all." Martin exhaled. "We can't fix everything." Calder spoke before he had decided to. "Then don't start with the pier." 3 heads turned toward him. Calder regretted the sentence immediately. Not because it was wrong, because now somebody was going to ask what he meant. June did. "What do you mean?" Calder looked toward the harbor office. Beyond it sat an old workshop building he had passed every day without paying much attention to it. Low roof, faded blue-gray siding, 2 wide doors facing the water. A sign over one entrance read, "Port Cormorant Maritime Association," though the lettering had peeled badly enough to make the organization look fictional. "That building still used?" June followed his gaze. "Barely." "For what?" "Storage, couple meetings in summer. Used to be a gear workshop." "Heat?" "Yes." "Power?" "Last I checked." Martin looked suspicious already. Calder shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. "I'm not saying rebuild anything." Wes snorted. "Good, because that sounded expensive." Calder ignored him. "I'm saying maybe you're trying to save the wrong structure." The sentence settled over them. June looked back at the old workshop. Calder continued. "People came to Six because that's where they worked. Fine. But they also came because everybody else was there." Wes crossed his arms. "That's supposed to make losing it better?" "No." Calder met his eyes. "But if the pier can't hold them anymore, maybe something else can." The workshop smelled like old rope, dust, and a faint trace of diesel that had probably soaked into the floor 20 years ago. June unlocked it that afternoon. Inside were 2 long workbenches, stacked folding chairs, outdated safety posters, broken shelving, several boxes of donated life jackets, and a marine radio mounted on a wall that nobody could confirm still worked. Calder walked through slowly. Morrow followed at his side, nose working through layers of old smells. Nora had invited herself. Wes had claimed he was only there to tell them why the idea would fail. Martin came because somebody had to be responsible. Silas came because everyone had told him not to. "You're supposed to be resting," June said. "I am standing very calmly." "That isn't resting." "It's closer than fishing." Nora handed him a thermos. "Sit down." Silas sat. Wes looked delighted. "I've waited 40 years to see somebody successfully order you around." Silas pointed at him. "Your day is coming." For the first time since Calder arrived in Port Cormorant, the room felt less like a problem being discussed and more like a place people might actually use. That made Calder nervous. Ideas were safer before they became real. He walked to the old radio. "Could this be checked?" June nodded. "Probably." "Bulletin board?" "Easy." "Coffee?" Nora said, "Already solved." Wes looked around. "You planning a social club?" "No." "Sounds like one." Calder leaned against the workbench. "Then don't call it that." "What do we call it?" "Nothing yet." Martin opened his folio. "That's encouraging." Calder looked at him. "You want the practical version?" "I would deeply appreciate one." So Calder gave it to him. A warm room near the harbor, weather updates, a radio, basic safety equipment. A place for people who worked alone to stop in before heading out. A simple, voluntary check-in board. Nothing invasive. No one signing their life away. Just names and expected return times if they wanted to use it. If someone who came every morning did not show, somebody called. That was it. June listened without interrupting. Wes stared at the floor. Nora had already moved to inspect the tiny kitchenette. Martin asked the question Calder knew was coming. Who's responsible if someone signs in and still gets hurt? Calder nodded. There it is. I'm serious. So am I. Martin stepped closer to the bench. If this becomes an official town program, you need liability structure, clear scope, insurance, building inspection, responsibility for equipment, emergency procedures. Wes groaned. Here comes the funeral. Martin turned on him. This is how you keep good intentions from becoming another lawsuit. Wes opened his mouth. Calder cut in. He's right. That surprised both of them. Martin looked at Calder. Calder shrugged. Doesn't mean we stop. June nodded. Temporary pilot through the Maritime Association, 90 days. Voluntary check-in, not rescue guarantee. Building inspection before public use. Martin thought. That might work. Wes looked offended by the word might. Nora called from the kitchenette. Coffee maker's disgusting. Calder glanced toward her. That the biggest problem? So far. Good. She held up the pot. I can fix this one. Something small shifted in the room. Not excitement. Ownership. That was more dangerous. The next morning, Elias inspected the workshop. He checked the floor loading, exits, furnace, electrical panels, roof condition, and the old double doors facing the harbor. By noon, he had produced a list. None of it was dramatic. Replace one smoke detector, service the furnace, repair a loose exterior step, have a licensed electrician inspect 2 outlets near the workbench, remove old fuel containers from the storage room. Building itself is fine, he said. Wes looked almost disappointed. What do you mean, fine? I mean, it's still standing without my intervention. High praise. Elias handed June the list. If the electrician clears the panel and the association's insurance is amended, I don't see a structural reason you can't use it. That afternoon, the place began changing. Not through a montage of miraculous transformation. Through work. Wes brought a vise and 2 old bench lamps. He refused to touch the wiring after June threatened to physically remove his toolbox if he tried. Nora brought a clean coffee maker, mugs that did not match, and a metal tin labeled, Don't Steal the Good Spoons. Martin returned with insurance language nobody enjoyed reading. June mounted a weatherboard near the entrance. Calder cleaned the marine radio contacts and discovered the unit still powered on, though it needed a new antenna lead. Silas sat near the wall for most of it, watching, disapproving. Finally, he said, "This is getting ridiculous." Nobody stopped working. He tried again. "You're building a babysitting room for old fishermen because I missed a bus stop?" Nora froze. Wes's shoulders tightened. June looked at Calder. Calder put down the screwdriver. "No." Silas's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, no?" "It's not because you missed a bus stop. I ended up in a hospital, and suddenly everybody needs a clipboard to walk outside." Calder looked toward the blank check-in board. "You think this is about you?" Silas gave him a look that said, "Obviously." Calder nodded toward Wes. "What happens if his hand locks up while he's alone in the shop?" Then Nora. "What happens if she slips carrying boxes behind the diner and nobody notices until closing?" Silas said nothing. Calder continued. "What happens if Dale's heat quits again?" "That's different." "Why?" Silas's mouth hardened. "Because they need help." Calder let the sentence sit. Silas heard it, so did everyone else. Wes slowly leaned back against the bench. Nora stopped wiping the same mug. Calder spoke more quietly. "So you're allowed to notice everybody else, but nobody's allowed to notice you?" Silas looked away. "That isn't what I said." "It's exactly what you said." The room went still. Not hostile, just honest enough to be uncomfortable. Silas looked toward the old workshop doors. "What are you going to call the place?" June shrugged. "We haven't decided." "If you name it after me, I'm burning it down." Wes said, "Heart doctor's going to love that plan." Silas ignored him. Calder picked up the screwdriver again. "It doesn't have your name on it." Silas looked back. "No memorial plaque?" "No." "No photograph of me looking noble?" "Absolutely not." "Good." Calder tightened one screw. "Nobody needs to know who started it." Then he looked toward the check-in board. "Just make sure next time a chair stays empty, somebody notices." Silas did not answer. That was enough. He left 15 minutes later, still complaining. At 7 the following morning, Calder unlocked the workshop with June. A cardboard box sat outside the door. No note. Inside were marine radio connectors, spare coax cable, an old handheld VHF unit, 2 microphone clips, a roll of electrical tape, and a wooden folding ruler. Calder picked up the ruler. He had seen it in Silas's coat pocket. June looked inside the box. "He say anything to you?" "No." "Me neither." Calder smiled faintly. Subtle man. Morrow sniffed the box once and sat beside it. Silas arrived 20 minutes later carrying coffee. He looked at the parts spread across the bench. "Huh." Calder stared at him. "What?" "Nothing." "Good." Silas took a seat near the window. That was as close to approval as anyone was going to get. Later that day, Lenora called Calder to the clinic. Morrow sat beside his chair while she placed several pages on the desk. "The rescue approved your temporary foster application." Calder looked at the forms. "My what?" "The one I discussed with you. You said paperwork." "This is paperwork." That sounded less permanent. "It is temporary." Calder picked up the first sheet. "Duration, open pending placement review." He frowned. "That's not a date." "No." Lenora watched him carefully. "You don't have to do it." Morrow was lying on the floor now, chin on one foreleg. Calder looked at him. There were easier options. The rescue could arrange another foster, somewhere fenced, stable, responsible. Somewhere, Morrow would probably spend several weeks trying to leave. Calder looked back at the document. What am I agreeing to? Food, veterinary care, housing, keeping him secured, follow-up evaluation, no representing him as an active SAR dog, no operational deployment. Fine. And if you leave town, you notify the rescue. Calder stopped. There it was, not responsibility, continuity. A sentence requiring him to consider where he would be later. Lenora noticed. You can take the forms home. Calder reached for a pen. No, he signed. The scratch of ink across paper sounded absurdly loud. Morrow lifted his head. Calder signed the final page. There. Lenora collected them. You're officially his temporary foster. Calder looked down at the shepherd. I've made worse administrative decisions. Morrow stood and pushed his nose briefly against Calder's hand. The gesture was so small, Calder almost wished it had not happened. Almost. They did not turn Morrow back into a working canine. Calder was careful about that. No vest, no patches, no dramatic commands on the waterfront. Instead, they began with 10 minutes in the mornings. Recall, sit, wait. Find a glove hidden behind a crate. Follow a scent trail 30 feet across packed snow. Walk the harbor perimeter without pulling. Morrow remembered quickly, too quickly sometimes. The first time Calder gave a search cue, the dog's entire posture changed, focused, alive, precise. Calder stopped the exercise before either of them became carried away. Enough, Morrow returned. No disappointment, just attention. Calder scratched behind the bent right ear. You don't have to earn breakfast. Morrow looked unconvinced. Calder understood. Some habits took longer to unlearn than commands. By the end of the week, the old maritime workshop had a functioning radio, a clean table, a weather board, safety gear, a coffee pot, and 12 names on a voluntary contact sheet. Not a program yet, not officially, just enough to begin. Morrow walked with Calder during June's morning perimeter rounds. No badge, no title. When they finished, he went inside the workshop and lay near the door while Wes complained about an engine, Nora refilled coffee, and Silas pretended not to supervise the radio repairs. Calder found himself doing the same thing every morning. Unlocking, checking weather, walking the harbor, coming back. A rhythm. He had spent years avoiding those. He had always believed routine became attachment, attachment became responsibility, and responsibility eventually became loss. Now Morrow slept near the workshop door, while the radio murmured marine forecasts into the room. Nothing had been solved. Pier 6 was still broken. Silas was still stubborn. Portland had called again. Calder had not returned the call yet. But for the first time in years, a responsibility without a clear ending did not feel like a trap. It felt remarkably like a place to stand. By late March, Port Cormorant had begun to look less like winter without quite becoming spring. Snow still covered the shaded edges of parking lots and gathered in gray ridges behind the bait sheds, but the roofs had started to clear. Water dripped steadily from gutters. The harbor stayed cold, the Atlantic still hard and metallic in the mornings, yet sunlight lasted longer each day and lay across the bay in bright silver bands. Pier 6 had not been rebuilt. Part of the damaged outer structure had been dismantled after Elias completed his assessment. The remaining section was fenced, braced, and marked for a future the town had not yet figured out how to pay for. No emergency grant had appeared large enough to solve everything. No private donor had arrived with a ceremonial check. No one had discovered a loophole that made decades of deferred maintenance disappear. The pier was still broken. But the old maritime workshop beside the harbor office opened at 6 every morning. That had become normal surprisingly fast. The first person in usually turned on the lights and the furnace. The second started coffee. By 6:30, somebody had tuned the marine radio to the weather broadcast, and by 7, the room had usually accumulated enough wet boots, jackets, complaints, and half-finished conversations to feel occupied. Nora supplied coffee on weekdays and denied responsibility for the pastries that sometimes appeared beside it. Wes had claimed the far workbench as his own, despite insisting for 3 weeks that he had no intention of becoming staff. A small row of fishing reels waited there most mornings for cleaning or repair. Dale Harmon came when his breathing allowed. He preferred a chair close to the radio and had developed the habit of correcting the automated forecast aloud, as if the National Weather Service might hear him. June mounted a tide chart on the wall and replaced it every month. Martin Keene still complained about forms, insurance renewals, volunteer waivers, and the fact that nobody ever used the correct version of anything. He was also the one who found a county safety grant small enough to be realistic and large enough to cover a new marine radio, emergency blankets, 2 upgraded first aid kits, and part of the furnace service. When Wes found out, he said, "Knew the paperwork disease had to be good for something." Martin told him to sign page 3. It had become that kind of place. Not a center, not a program anyone bragged about, just a room people expected to find open. Calder noticed that distinction mattered to him. He had stayed. At first, only because the temporary foster agreement for Morrow required stability. Then because June needed short-term help with winter maintenance and safety inspections. Then because the job in Portland began calling less often after Calder stopped returning calls promptly. Eventually, he called them himself. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. He thanked Peter for holding the position, said he would not be taking the full-time contract, did not explain much beyond that. Peter asked whether Calder had found something better. Calder looked through the workshop window toward the harbor. "No," he said. Then, after a pause, "Just something I'm not done with." That answer surprised him enough that he remembered it later. He did not announce that Port Cormorant was home. He did not buy property. He did not make promises about next year. June offered him a seasonal contract helping the harbor office with maintenance checks, winter safety work, and the sort of practical jobs that accumulated around docks faster than paperwork could name them. Calder accepted through April. That was all. For him, it was enough of a commitment to feel dangerous. Silas returned to the waterfront slowly. At first, he came twice a week, then 3 times. His cardiologist allowed light activity, but not solo fishing, and Silas obeyed with the irritated precision of a man who intended to prove compliance could be insulting. He still complained when Nora asked whether he had eaten, still scowled if June asked how he was feeling, still treated the phrase, "take it easy," as a personal attack. But every morning he came to the workshop, Silas walked to the check-in board. The board was nothing fancy. Names on the left, expected return or departure time on the right. A dry erase marker tied to the frame with string because Wes had lost the first 2. Silas would remove his glove, write S. Reddick, then add something deliberately unhelpful in the next column. 9:30-ish, or before lunch, probably. Once, when I feel like it. June erased that one and made him write a time. Calder had expected Silas to resist forever. Instead, the old fisherman simply found ways to complain while participating. That seemed healthier than agreement. One morning Calder arrived early and found Silas already inside. No one else had come yet. Silas sat near the window with a mug of coffee, watching dawn spread across the harbor. His folding wooden ruler lay on the table beside him. Calder hung his jacket near the heater. "You're early." Silas shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." "Heart?" "No." Calder did not ask again. That was another thing he had learned. Attention did not require interrogation. Silas looked at the check-in board. "Funny thing." "What?" "I used to think that thing would make me feel watched." "And?" Mostly makes me feel annoyed. Calder nodded. Progress. Silas smiled into his coffee. That was as much as either of them needed. The adoption letter arrived on a Tuesday. Calder almost threw it away, not intentionally. It came in a plain envelope mixed with a utility bill, a harbor office notice, and an advertisement for replacement windows. He opened it at the small apartment he had rented above a marine supply store, expecting another foster review form. Morrow lay near the radiator, one foreleg extended, the pale curved marking above his left wrist visible where the fur caught the light. Calder read the first paragraph, then the second. The rescue organization had completed its placement review. Veterinary reports were current. Housing was approved. Behavioral evaluation was positive. The temporary foster could become permanent if Calder accepted. He read it again. Morrow opened one amber-brown eye. Calder looked at him. You knew this was coming? The dog closed his eye. Helpful. Calder sat down at the kitchen table. The page was simple. There was no language about destiny. No declaration that Morrow had chosen him. Just legal transfer of ownership and responsibility. Food, care, medical decisions, licensing. A name attached to another name. Calder had signed documents far more serious than this during his Coast Guard years. Documents involving vessels, equipment, operational responsibility. Some of them had carried consequences measured in lives. This one felt stranger. Because there was no end date, he signed anyway. The following week, confirmation arrived. Calder read that letter twice, too, then placed it flat on the table. Morrow lifted his head. Calder folded his arms. Well? The shepherd waited. Looks like you're stuck with me. Morrow's tail struck the floor once. Thump. Calder looked away before the dog could make too much of it. Don't get sentimental. Another thump. Ridiculous animal. Morrow lowered his head again. Calder left the letter on the table instead of putting it into a drawer. That was the part he noticed later. By then, their mornings had acquired a rhythm. Not the old SAR routine. Calder was careful about that. Morrow did not wear official patches. No one called him an active canine. They worked short exercises because the dog enjoyed having something to solve. Recall near the empty docks. A hidden glove behind stacked crates. Simple scent discrimination between two canvas bags. Slow perimeter walks where Calder let Morrow pause and listen without turning every reaction into a task. The old precision was still there. Sometimes Calder saw it switch on in an instant, the shoulders aligning, eyes sharpening, body ready to work. But Morrow had also learned something else. He could stop. He could lie near the workshop heater while Wes argued about carburetors. He could sleep through Martin explaining liability. He could take a piece of cooked fish from Silas without earning it first. That last part mattered more than Calder expected. One morning, Silas held out a small piece from a paper bag. Morrow took it, then sat. Silas waited for him to perform something. Morrow did nothing. Calder leaned against the doorway. Looks like he finally trained you. Silas frowned. Into what? Feeding him for free. Silas looked offended, then gave Morrow another piece. The old bench from Pier 6 had been moved during the partial demolition. Nobody had planned anything symbolic around it. Wes simply refused to let the town throw it away. So he and Elias hauled it to the front of the workshop, tightened two loose boards, and set it facing the water. The wood remained scarred. One armrest leaned slightly. Silas claimed it on clear mornings. That was where Calder found him on the final morning of March. The sky was bright, almost painfully so. Meltwater dripped from the workshop roof in steady intervals. Morrow and Calder came down the waterfront from the north end after finishing a perimeter walk.
Months earlier, the dog would have accelerated as soon as Pier 6 entered view, straight toward the bench, straight toward Silas's old place. This morning he did not. Morrow walked past the remains of Pier 6 without changing pace. Calder noticed but said nothing.
They approached the workshop. Silas sat on the bench with a paper bag beside him. Wes stood in the doorway holding a carburetor as though somebody had personally offended him with it. Nora was setting down a fresh coffee urn. Dale occupied his chair inside near the radio. June stood outside talking with Elias over a new tide chart. Martin's car was parked near the harbor office, which meant paperwork was probably approaching. Morrow slowed, not toward Silas, toward all of them. He looked through the open workshop door, at Wes, at Dale, at Nora moving behind the table. His ears shifted toward June's voice, then toward Silas, then back to Calder. It took only seconds. Nothing dramatic, no train sweep, no search behavior, just attention. Then Morrow moved to the bench and lay in the space between Silas's boots and Calder's legs. Silas reached into the paper bag and produced a piece of cooked haddock. Morrow accepted it. Silas scratched beneath his chin. "Still think he's waiting for me?" Calder looked down. "No." Silas tilted his head. "What's he doing then?" Calder glanced toward the workshop. Nora was telling Wes not to put greasy parts beside the cups. Wes was telling her the cups had survived worse. Dale had raised the radio volume. June was laughing at something Elias had said. Normal noise. The kind Calder once would have avoided because normal noise meant people had begun expecting you to be there tomorrow. Morrow rested his chin across his paws. Calder said, "I think he just likes knowing everybody showed up." Silas laughed. Not loudly, just one rough breath of amusement. Then he shifted on the bench and patted the space beside him. Calder remained standing for a moment. Old instinct. Standing kept you ready. Standing kept departure easy. Silas did not pat the bench again. He simply waited. Calder sat. The harbor spread in front of them. Small boats moved beyond the breakwater, slow, dark shapes against the bright water. A gull landed on the remains of Pier 6 and lifted again almost immediately. Behind them, the workshop continued without requiring either man. That felt important. Silas opened the paper bag again. "You know," he said, "I used to think if I stopped being useful, people would stop having a reason to keep me around." Calder looked at him. Silas's face remained turned toward the bay. "I wasn't exactly wrong." Calder raised an eyebrow. Silas continued, "People do like useful." "True. But maybe I gave it too much credit." Calder looked down at Morrow. The dog's eyes had closed. His right ear, with its small outward bend, still moved toward the sound of an approaching boat. Calder said, "Maybe the bar's lower." Silas glanced at him. "How low?" "Maybe somebody just has to notice when you're not there." Silas considered that. Terrible business model. Probably. They sat quietly. The workshop roof released another line of meltwater, droplets catching the sunlight before disappearing into the dark gravel below. Nothing had been repaired completely. Pier 6 was still broken. Dale's lungs were still bad. Wes's hands still hurt. Silas still had cardiology appointments. June still had to close things people wanted open. Martin still had budgets that did not care about sentiment. Calder still woke some mornings with the instinct to pack before anyone could ask what he was doing next. None of that had vanished. That was what made the morning feel real. Healing, Calder had begun to understand, was a poor word for some things. It suggested damage disappeared. Some damage simply became part of the structure. Like an old pier reinforced over decades. Like a hand that no longer closed properly, but could still repair a reel. Like a dog that had once needed commands and had slowly learned how to rest. like a man who still preferred silence but no longer mistook absence for freedom. Morrow opened his eyes when a fishing boat eased against the dock. He raised his head, watched, then lowered it again. He was not waiting for someone who had failed to return. He was not searching for a lost job. He was simply there, among people who had learned, imperfectly, to notice one another. Calder looked toward the check-in board through the workshop door. 6 names already marked that morning, his own among them. He had written it without thinking. That made him smile, barely. Belonging, it turned out, did not require becoming indispensable. It did not require saving everyone. It did not even require promising forever. Sometimes it meant staying long enough that your absence would leave a shape somebody recognized. Beside him, Silas shifted on the old bench. Morrow slept between them, and for that morning every chair that mattered was occupied. Sometimes the greatest kindness is not rescuing someone from a storm. It is simply noticing when they are missing. Calder, Silas, and Morrow each believed that being useful was what gave them a place in the world. But Port Cormorant taught them something quieter. We matter because we belong to one another, not because we can always be strong. Maybe someone in your life has been absent lately, quieter than usual, or carrying more than they admit. A call, a cup of coffee, or simply showing up may be the small grace they need. If this story stayed with you, share what it meant to you in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about loyalty, second chances, and the people who choose to stay, subscribe and join us for the next one. May you have people who notice when your chair is empty, and may you be that person for someone else.